Arizona Territory, 1879. The sun was high and cruel over the dust-choked yard behind the general store in Dry Creek when Beatrice Jane Jerlow got whipped for talking back. The rope tied her wrists tight to the pole, raw against her skin. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, blood blooming through the cotton where the lash had already kissed her back. The store owner's son, Hank, stood red-faced and seething, spitting curses between each strike like it was his right. "You don't tell a man like me no," he growled, swinging the whip again. Beatrice bit down on her scream. She would not give him that. Her jaw trembled, her knees buckled, but she stayed upright. Pride burned hotter than pain. All she had done was tell him to keep his hands off her. That was it. No woman in Dry Creek dared, and now she was paying the price. The crowd had gathered like they always did. No one stepped in. No one ever did. Folks just watched, mouths tight, eyes lowered like if they pretended not to see. It would not stain them, but one man moved. He had been leaning against the side of the saloon, one boot hooked over the other, a low-brimmed hat hiding most of his face. Silent, still, until he wasn't. He crossed the street in long, unhurried strides. Dust kicked up behind his spurs. No one stopped him. He walked straight into the yard, right past Hank, who raised the whip again. The man caught it mid-air, his hand closed around the leather with calm steadiness, like it was nothing more than a loose thread. "Let go," Hank barked. The man said nothing. He yanked the whip from Hank's hand, spun it once, and tossed it to the side. Then, without a word, he unhooked the rope from Beatrice's wrists. She barely had time to blink before he lifted her into his arms, not rough. Not like she was broken, either, just sure, solid. She curled instinctively against his chest, her breath catching at the feel of him, warm, steady, smelling faintly of sweat and saddle soap. He did not look at the crowd, he did not speak, he just carried her off through the street, past the saloon. Out beyond the edge of town where the hills rolled dry and gold and the breeze smelled like mesquite, Beatrice did not ask where they were going. Her back throbbed, but her heart pounded louder. She watched his jaw, the set of it, hard and unreadable. He looked like the kind of man who had seen too much and said too little for most of his life. He stopped near a bluff where a single cottonwood offered shade. His horse was tied nearby. A bedroll was already down beside a fire pit, cold ashes still scattered. He set her down gently on the blanket and knelt beside her. Only then did he speak. "Name's Fletcher Kade." His voice was deep, low, like distant thunder that never quite struck. Beatrice stared at him, dazed. "Why did you help me?" Fletcher met her eyes. "Because no man gets to do that to a woman," she swallowed. She had not cried during the whipping, but now her eyes burned. "Everyone else just watched. I ain't everyone else." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a flask. "It's just creek water," he said, uncorking it and handing it to her. She drank, coughing a little. Her hands trembled. Fletcher tore a strip from a clean cloth and dipped it in the water. "Turn," he said softly. She hesitated, then shifted so he could see her back. When the cloth touched one of the welts, she hissed. "I'll be careful," he said, and he was. He cleaned every cut with slow, sure hands. He did not ask what she had said to earn the whipping. He already knew enough. When he was done, she sat still, watching him pack the cloth away. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said quietly. Fletcher looked at her. "What about family? My parents died in Kansas. I came here to work at the store, thought I could save enough to start fresh somewhere else." Her voice cracked. "Guess that was foolish." Fletcher shook his head. "No. You were trying to live." The wind shifted the cottonwood leaves. The air smelled like dust and dry grass. Beatrice looked at him, really looked. He had lines around his eyes, not from smiling. His hands were nicked with old scars. He looked about 30, maybe a bit more. He carried the weight of things unsaid. "You always save women tied to poles?" she asked, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. His lips twitched. "No, just you." They sat in silence for a while. Her back throbbed, but the pain was duller now. She leaned against the tree, feeling the warmth of the sun on her legs, Fletcher nearby. He had not asked anything of her, not even thanks. She studied the way he moved, quiet and deliberate, not nervous, just careful, like he had learned the hard way not to rush. "You live out here?" she asked. He gave a short nod. "Got a cabin a few miles from here, up near the ridge. You live alone?" For now, Beatrice hesitated. "Could I come with you, just until I figure out where to go?" Fletcher looked at her. His face was unreadable again, but his eyes were warm. "You can stay as long as you need," she held his gaze. "I do not want to be a burden, you are not." The wind picked up. She felt something strange stir in her chest, not fear, not pain, something quieter, safer. "You sure about this?" she asked. "I would not have brought you here if I was not," she nodded slowly. "All right." He stood and offered her his hand. She took it and he helped her up. She leaned on him a little. He did not mind. They rode double on his horse, her arms around his waist, her cheek pressed against his back. The wind pulled at her hair, but she held on, not just to him, but to the feeling that maybe for the first time in a long time she was not alone. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had dipped low, casting long gold across the hills. Fletcher helped her down, led her inside. It was small but clean. A fire was already lit in the hearth. He poured her a tin cup of coffee. She took it with both hands. Their eyes met again. Fletcher said, "You are safe here, Beatrice." And for the first time in years, she believed it. The sky had turned the color of cooling embers when Fletcher stepped out to split wood, leaving Beatrice inside with the crackle of the fire and a silence she didn't know what to do with. The cabin had a lean-to roof and plank walls chinked with clay, and the air inside held the scent of pine, pitch, and old tobacco. His rifle leaned beside the door. A tin lantern hung on a nail. She could hear the steady rhythm of his axe outside, each strike clean and certain. She eased onto the bench beside the hearth, careful of the bandages across her back. A kettle simmered low on the coals. She reached out, poured herself another half cup, and wrapped her hands around the warmth. The quiet wasn't threatening, it just pressed in unfamiliar. Like a room with no corners to hide in, when Fletcher came back in, a coil of split wood cradled in one arm, his shirt hung open at the throat, collar damp from sweat. He set the wood near the stove without a word and stoked the fire up from coals to flame. "You ever work with animals?" His voice came from the shadows. "Some," she answered. "My pa kept mules for hauling freight. I helped feed and brush 'em clean hooves when I was tall enough." He nodded once. "I got 2 mares need looking after." "You feel up to it tomorrow, I'll show you." The offer settled into her like a stone dropped in still water. "I'd like that." "Good." He poured a cup for himself and leaned against the wall near the fire, never quite sitting, like stillness made him restless. In the flickering light, the edges of his face softened, jaw rough with stubble, eyes dark and unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "How long you been out here alone?" she asked. 5 years. She traced the rim of her cup with her thumb. "That by choice. I got tired of burying people." He didn't say it like a confession, just a fact laid bare. She looked down into the dark swirl of her drink. "I never thought I'd end up here. Arizona was just supposed to be a stop. You planning on moving east?" "I was." "Thought maybe New Mexico, El Paso maybe." He didn't answer right away. The fire popped, sending a spark curling into the air. "Folks in El Paso don't care about your name," he said finally, "but they won't care much about your safety either." She looked up. "You think I should stay?" "I think no one should be forced to run when they've done nothing wrong." He moved from the wall to the far end of the room, where a shelf held a basin and a tin mirror. He rolled up his sleeves and washed his hands, the water sloshing quiet in the bowl. "You don't talk much, do you?" she asked, watching him from where she sat. "I talk when there's something worth saying." "You think I'm worth saying something too?" He picked up the towel, dried his hands slow. "I carried you out of town." "That ought to say enough." She stood, her legs still stiff from the ride. "I didn't ask you to, I know." She crossed the room, stopping a few feet from him. The firelight caught in her hair, casting it copper red. "But I'm not sorry you did." He met her gaze and didn't look away. "Neither am I." The kettle hissed as it boiled over. Neither of them moved. Finally, she stepped past him, lifted the pot from the heat and set it aside. Steam curled up and vanished into the rafters. "There a place I can sleep?" she asked, not turning around. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll stay by the door." She turned to face him. "You don't have to do that, I know," he said again. "But I will." She held his eyes a moment longer, then nodded once and stepped into the side room. The bed was narrow but clean, the quilt patched by hand, each stitch small and careful. She lay down on her side, breath shallow. The ache in her back flared, but it was manageable. Outside the door, she could hear Fletcher move metal scraping wood, the soft creak of leather as he settled into a chair. She didn't sleep right away. Her mind wandered places it hadn't dared in months. She thought about the way he'd looked at her without pity, like she was still whole. Like she wasn't something broken he'd picked up out of charity. Tomorrow she'd see the mares. She'd pick up a brush again. Do something with her hands besides defend herself. And maybe, if he kept talking, she'd learn the shape of the quiet that lived in him. Maybe it wasn't an emptiness at all, but room for something to grow. The mares stood quiet in the corral, their ears flicking as Fletcher opened the gate and stepped inside. Beatrice followed, the stiffness in her back pulling with each careful step. She didn't complain. The sun had barely crested the ridge, casting long blue shadows across the dry grass, and the air was still cool enough to breathe deep. He handed her a curry comb. "Start slow," he said. "They don't know you yet." She reached for the bay, her movements even, letting the mare sniff her palm before she touched its flank. The horse twitched once, then settled. Beatrice dragged the comb in steady strokes, the rhythm easing something knotted beneath her ribs. Fletcher worked the chestnut beside her, neither of them speaking for a long while. The silence wasn't heavy. It had room in it. "You break these two yourself?" she asked, glancing up. He nodded. "Found them half-starved near the wash 2 winters back. Took months to gain their trust. They follow you easy. They remember what I didn't do to them." She looked at him then, the sunlight catching the edge of his profile. "You ever think about leaving this place?" "I think about what I'd lose if I did." She didn't press. Instead, she moved on to the second mare, brushing along its shoulder, her hands sure now. After they finished, he led her to the shed behind the cabin. Inside, tack hung from pegs and a half-built gate leaned against the far wall. He picked up a hammer, offered it handle first. "You know how to drive nails, if they go where I tell them," she said. He gave a nod of approval. They worked side by side, wood dust rising around them, the scent of cedar sharp in the still air. When the last board was set, Fletcher stood back and wiped his brow with his sleeve. "You work like someone who's had to," he said. "I have." He studied her a moment. "What did you want before all this?" She stared at the gate, her voice quiet. "To read without interruption, to have a room that locked from the inside, maybe a place with a porch. Enough quiet to think without fear jumping into it. You could still have that. Not in Dry Creek." He met her eyes. "I wasn't talking about Dry Creek." They left the tools where they were and walked back toward the cabin, the sun higher now, catching on the tops of the grasses and making them shine like wheat. A jackrabbit darted through the brush ahead of them, and she watched it disappear into the scrub. Inside, she sat at the table while Fletcher ladled beans and salt pork from the pot into 2 tin bowls. He set one in front of her and sat across, folding his hands for a moment before eating. She did the same, eyes closed briefly, though no words passed her lips. Halfway through the meal, she looked up. "You ever been married?" He chewed, swallowed. "No, why not? Didn't have anything worth offering till I got this place quiet." She considered that. And now, he looked at her, not blinking. "I'd offer it to someone who knew how to stay." Her spoon paused in the bowl. "You don't know me. I know what you held through." She didn't answer right away. The fire popped once in the hearth. Outside, a hawk cried over the ridge. "I didn't think it mattered anymore," she said finally. "What I wanted, what I feared, I thought. Maybe that part got whipped out of me." Fletcher leaned forward. "It didn't." She met his gaze. "Do you want me to stay because you feel sorry for me?" "No." His voice was low, firm. "I want you to stay because I see you. And I ain't looked at anyone in a long time." That stopped her. Not from fear, she wasn't afraid of Fletcher, but from how steady the truth sounded, like it had been waiting for her to be ready to hear it. She set her spoon down. "I don't know how to rebuild something I never had." "You don't have to. You just step forward. I'll meet you there." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she reached across the table, slow, careful. Her fingers brushed his. He didn't pull away. "I can try," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He turned his hand over, wrapped his fingers around hers. "You don't have to do it alone." Outside, the wind picked up through the cottonwoods, and for the first time in too long, Beatrice felt something that might become hope. Not because she was rescued, but because someone had seen her as worth the saving and stayed. The garden bed behind the cabin was no more than a patch of turned earth bordered by half-buried stones, choked with weeds and brittle stalks from last year's growth. Fletcher handed Beatrice a hoe and crouched beside her, brushing dry soil from the base of a low, struggling pepper plant. "Frost took most of the roots last winter," he said, "but some'll come back if we clear the rest." She nodded, pressing her palm against the rough wood handle. The sun had risen high enough to warm the back of her neck, and the smell of disturbed earth carried something close to comfort. They worked without speaking, side by side, until sweat dampened her collar and the weeds lay in limp piles. Fletcher straightened, wiped his brow, and looked toward the ridge. "There's a spring east of here," he said. "Bit of a climb, but the water's clean. You up for it?" Beatrice stretched her sore shoulder. "I've got 2 good legs and a will." "That's enough." He gave a short nod and stepped inside to fetch the canteens. She watched the way he moved measured, never wasteful, and followed when he returned, a canvas sack slung over one shoulder and his rifle in hand. The trail wound through low pines and over broken rock. Lizards skittered from their path, and cicadas rasped from the brush. They didn't speak much, just the occasional call out when footing grew loose or the incline steepened, but the quiet between them was easier now, like it had learned how to breathe. At the top, the spring bubbled from beneath a shelf of stone, collecting in a shallow pool before trickling into a runoff stream that vanished downhill. Fletcher crouched to fill the canteens, and Beatrice knelt beside him, cupping water in her palm. It was cold and clear, sharp on her tongue. After a moment, she leaned back against the rock and looked out. The land stretched far, all dun and ochre, broken only by the dark line of cottonwoods snaking through the valley. "I used to dream about the ocean," she said. "Didn't really matter which one. Just the idea of water that went on forever." Fletcher capped a canteen and sat beside her. "You ever see it?" "No." She picked at a thread on her sleeve. "Got as far as St. Louis once, then things went wrong." He didn't ask what. She didn't offer. Instead, she tilted her head toward him. "You ever leave Arizona?" "Once. Went north, up into Idaho territory. Thought maybe I'd trap through the winter." He paused. "Didn't take. Why not? Too empty, even for me." She let that settle. Then, after a long pause, she asked, "You ever think about children?" His brow knit slightly. "Not much use thinking on what don't come. But if it did," he turned his head, studied the edge of her profile. "I reckon I'd want to raise 'em where the air's clean, where they could see stars at night, where no man lays a hand on them or their mother." Her throat tightened. She looked down at her hands, dirt still under her nails. "That sounds like a place I could live in." He didn't speak right away. "Then, you'd make a fine mother. You carry what's hard and don't let it turn you cruel." She blinked against the sudden sting behind her eyes and forced a breath. "I don't know what I'd be. I've never had the chance." He shifted, his shoulder brushing hers. "You'd be exactly what you are now, just with more to love." They sat quiet a while longer, the breeze tugging at her hair, birdsong threading through the pines. Then Fletcher stood, offered his hand, and she took it without hesitation. On the walk back, she asked, "What's your plan for tonight?" Was thinking beans and cornbread. "Maybe some bacon if the salt's still good." She smiled faintly. "You always cook?" "Only when I want to eat." They crested the last rise, and the cabin came into view, small, weathered, but standing firm in the light. Beatrice let her gaze rest on it, then on him, walking just ahead. The wind stirred the back of his shirt, and the rifle shifted over his shoulder like it belonged there. She realized, as they stepped into the yard, that she'd stopped thinking about where she'd go next. Fletcher handed her the canteens. "You take care of these." "I'll see to the fire." She nodded, and when their fingers brushed in the pass, neither of them pulled away. The cornbread cooled on the windowsill while Fletcher carved a thin slice of bacon into the skillet, its edges curling in the heat. Beatrice stood near the door, winding her hair into a loose braid. The quiet of the cabin felt different now, less like something between them and more like something they shared. "I'll need to go into Benson soon," Fletcher said, not looking up from the pan. "Grain's running low." "Might trade for seed if the store's still honest." Beatrice leaned against the frame, arms folded. "You going alone?" He tossed a pinch of salt over the meat. "Wasn't planning to." She crossed the room, took the dishcloth from the peg, and began setting the table. What do people in Benson know about you? Enough to keep their distance, not enough to ask questions. She placed 2 plates down, her fingers brushing the table's worn edge. You think they'll recognize me? Fletcher finally turned, his eyes steady. They might. But if they speak your name, they'll have to say mine after it. Her breath caught, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she poured water into a tin cup and set it beside his plate. Then we'll go together. They ate without rush, the room filled with the small sounds of cutlery and the soft crackle of the hearth. When the meal was done, Fletcher stepped outside to check the horses while Beatrice washed the dishes in the basin near the door. The sun was dropping low behind the ridge, casting orange light across the yard. She found him near the fence, checking the latch on the gate he'd repaired. The light caught in his hair, streaked with dust and gold. "You trust me to ride into town with you?" she asked, voice low. He straightened. "I trust you with more than that." Her fingers curled around the post beside her. "I've never belonged anywhere, not really. I've got land, a roof, and a woman I'd ride through fire for." He stepped closer, his voice steady. "That sounds like belonging to me." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out and touched the edge of his collar, calloused fingers brushing the fabric. "You sure?" "I don't say things I don't mean." She stepped closer, the space between them gone in a breath. Her hand slid up along his jaw, thumb grazing the edge of his cheek. He didn't flinch. She leaned in, pressing her forehead gently against his. "I'm still learning how to be soft," she whispered. "Still learning how to stay." "I'll be here when you do," he said. When she kissed him, it wasn't hurried. It was quiet, like every step they'd taken led to this moment. His arms wrapped around her, one hand at her back, careful of what still healed. Her fingers curled into his shirt and the world went still. Later, they sat on the porch, knees touching, watching the last light fade behind the hills. The air cooled and she pulled his coat over her shoulders. He didn't speak, just rested his hand over hers. "There's a part of me that still waits for someone to take it all away," she said softly. He looked out over the land. "Ain't no one coming, just us now." She nodded and after a while leaned her head against his shoulder. They left for Benson at first light 3 days later. The ride was long but uneventful. Beatrice wore a wide-brimmed hat low over her brow. Fletcher rode beside her, rifle strapped across his back, his presence enough to keep curious eyes at bay. At the mercantile, he traded cured meat and a pair of hand-carved stirrups for seed and oats. Beatrice picked out a spool of thread and a packet of marigold seed from a dusty shelf. When the storekeep asked her name, she answered with Fletcher's last. On the ride back, they stopped near a dry arroyo to rest the horses. Beatrice knelt beside a patch of wild sage, brushing her fingers along the soft green. Fletcher handed her the water flask and sat beside her, silent. "You ever think about building something more permanent?" she asked. He glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "A room with a door that swings inward. Maybe a table longer than 2 seats, a place where people might come through, stay a while." He considered this. "You wanting company, I'm wanting a life, not just a place to hide." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll build it." They returned to the cabin before dusk, the mules heavy with feed and flour. Beatrice unpacked the supplies while Fletcher unhitched the tack. That night they sat on the floor by the hearth, blueprints sketched in charcoal on scrap wood. She traced a line for a window facing east. He marked a spot for a rain barrel. They built the addition before the first frost. A second room set low against the wind. Beatrice stitched new curtains from flower sackcloth. Fletcher carved a cradle from cedar planks and placed it near the hearth, though no word was spoken yet of futures beyond what they held in their hands. In spring, when the marigolds bloomed, Beatrice planted them by the porch. Fletcher dug a post for a bell beside the front step. She rang at the morning. She felt the first stirrings of new life inside her. He came running, breathless, eyes wide. She took his hand and placed it against her belly. "Still want that life?" she asked. He dropped to one knee, pressing his forehead to her middle. "With you always." Years later, the porch held 2 rockers and the sound of small feet thudding across the floor. Beatrice still tended the garden, her back straight, hands sure. Fletcher built a smokehouse and a barn with a hayloft tall enough for a boy to climb. They grew old in the way quiet people do, side by side, steady as seasons. In the end, it wasn't rescue that saved them. It was choosing again and again to stay. And in that choice, they built a love strong enough to hold.